And welcome back to yet another episode of the Gateways podcast. This is Gateways number 11. Now today we're going to be continuing on with our discussions on rhythm. And today we're going to be mainly focusing on what exactly is tempo and what exactly are time signatures, because they play very crucial roles in music. So let's begin with what exactly is tempo. Well, the tempo is the speed of the underlying beat. And it's often represented in BPM or beats per minute. If you want some context, if you want a song which has one beat every second, that would be at 60 beats per minute. Now, understanding tempo is actually very important depending on the type of genre of music you're going for. If you're going for a type of music which is more upbeat sounding, you'll obviously want a higher tempo. Whereas if you're going for something which is a little more calm, you'll probably want a lower tempo. Now, this isn't always true, but it should definitely be considered whenever you're writing a piece of music. And you also need to know tempo relative to the time signature you're in, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But overall, tempo is a very important tool, and something that is useful to learn is kind of how to approximate a tempo by ear. So two things you should learn how to do is, one, you should learn 120, because 120 is 2 beats every second, and from there you can kind of get a relative gauge as to what a time signature is. You can also think if you learn 180, that's 3 beats per second. If you learn 60, that's 2 beats per second. And keeping these things in mind will it'll definitely make performing easier. It'll make practice easier. Though it's recommended that you do use a metronome to keep time whenever you're playing. That's something that you should always do. Never play something that you haven't played a lot or practiced a lot without a metronome, because what you can end up doing is you can end up getting yourself stuck on a time which isn't right, like a tempo that isn't right, and then when you go to play it, you could be playing it too fast or too slow, depending on the rest of the ensemble that you're playing with. Even if you're playing it alone, that it can also lead to variations in tempo that aren't in the piece, and unless that's what you're going for, then that's not very desirable. So with that being kept in mind, let's move right on to time signatures. Now, what is a time signature? It's how many beats are contained within a measure, and what note value is equivalent to the beat. What are some examples? Well, you have things like, I've said 4/4 before. 4/4 is known as common time and can also be represented as a C. But you also have things like 3/4. Now, what's the difference? Well, in 3/4, it's stating that there are 3 notes, and the 4 states that it's quarter note beats, right? So keeping that in mind, the whole point of a time signature is usually supposed to be to allow the musician to understand the rhythms being played. Now there are 2 types of time signatures. There's simple, well, there aren't only 2 types, but the 2 most common types are simple and compound time signatures. So what are simple time signatures? Well, it's 2 numerals which are stacked above one another, with the lower indicating the note value that represents 1 beat, which is typically a power of 2. And then you also have the upper numeral, which indicates how many beats are in a bar. So an example of this would be if you're in 2/4 time, that means that there are 2 quarter note beats per bar. If you're in 3/8 time, that means that there are 3 eighth note beats per bar. Now, something to keep in mind if you're doing performance, the 3 most common time signatures are 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. And something else to keep in mind if you're doing performance, if you're playing in 4/4, there are times when you'll see a C instead of a time signature, which is meant to represent common time. But then you also have the variant for 2/2, which is C with a dash from the top to the bottom, which is meant to represent 2/2. Now, what's the other type? Well, now you have compound meter, right? So what is compound? Well, it's when the beat of a bar divides naturally into 3 equal parts. Each beat contains a triple pulse, let's say. So, for example, if you have a song in 9/8, right, which is compound triple meter technically, that's different than a song in 6/8, which is compound duple meter. Now, what exactly do these values mean, and what exactly does compound mean? Well, I think that the best way to convey an understanding of this would be through an example. So looking at a simple time signature of 3/4, it's what's known as a triple meter time signature, and it represents 3 quarter notes per measure. In terms of how you feel it as the beat, it's 1, 2, 3. Or if you're counting it in 8th notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and. However, if you look at a compound time signature, which is it's not like 3 groups of 2/8 notes in 3/4. Instead, it's 2 groups of 3/8 notes in like subdivisions. So the way you'd feel the beat in 6/8 is more 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rather than 1 and 2 and 3 and. Now those rhythms feel different, and that's kind of the whole purpose of different time signatures. It's meant to represent different feelings. It's kind of like different uses of harmony. It's meant to convey different tones depending on the time signature that you're playing in. Each one has its own feeling to it. Now, before I mentioned like duple or triple, etc. Now, what exactly are these? Well, if you have a time signature that indicates 2 beats per bar, then you're in duple meter. 3 beats per bar, or triple meter. You also have quadruple, quintuple, and so on. But what duple, triple, and whatever means is it's stating how many beats are there per measure. So a triple meter would have 3 beats. A duple meter would have 2 beats, etc. Now, one thing that should be kept in mind is that there are technically points where you can interchange the rhythm you're using depending on the time signature. For example, if you played a rhythm in 3/4, you could technically play the exact same rhythm in 3/8 if you change all the notes from their 3/4 version to their 3/8 version, and it's technically interchangeable. Now, this is important to keep in mind, right? Because that opens up some interesting possibilities, because like mentioned previously, although 3/4 and 3/8 are technically interchangeable, you can still create some interesting rhythmic lines by changing it to 3/8 because you're feeling the rhythm in a different way. So let's just go over some more examples, because examples are a very good way to learn. So, what exactly is each time signature kind of used for? Well, in 4/4, which is like very widely used, you see it in country, pop, rock. It's incredibly common. So keeping that in mind, if you have a simple drum pattern, it would probably sound a lot like this. Now, that sound is incredibly common, and it's used very much in a lot of music because it's very grounded. Now, you also have things like, you have cut time, which is 2/2. It's used in a lot of time in marches and orchestral music. It's pretty common in musical theater too, which is interesting. You also have 2/4, used in marches a lot, as well as I think polka. You have like 3/4 used for like waltzes, ballads, R&B, that kind of thing. You have like 3/8, which is it's used generally for the same thing as 3/4, but it kind of suggests like a higher tempo. Now you also have things like 6/8 in terms of like compound time, which you see a lot in like jigs. You see it in marches sometimes. You see it in a lot of rock music. You have 9/8. It's used in some jigs. It's been used in the Ride of the Valkyries, I believe, briefly. It was used by Bach occasionally. It's not very common, but it is used. You also have like 12/8, which is kind of like a blues feel, and like doo-wop, so it's a little bit more grounded in jazz. And then alongside this concept of compound and simple time signatures, you also kind of have complex time signatures, which I think they're kind of interesting. So they don't fit into the like duple or triple categories that the other ones do, but they're called like complex or maybe even odd time signatures. Now, what does that mean? Well, unlike things like duple or triple, where it's kind of divisible, like they're powers of 2, or it's divisible by 3. These are values that aren't really divisible by 3. So it's like time signature in which like the upper value is like odd rather than even. That's kind of how it works. So it's like, let's say like 3/4. 3/4 is an example of a complex time signature in which it's odd because it's 3/4. So that includes things like 5/4 or 9/8, which are all actually, you can see them pretty regularly, and they are used a decent amount of time. But it's another category that you have to keep in mind, and it's they have different beat stresses depending on the context in which they're being played in, right? And that's another thing. Simple and compound also have beat stresses. There are certain points in which the beat is stressed at specific points, kind of like what I mentioned earlier, like 3/4. It's 1, 2, 3, 1. 1 is the most stressed beat, whereas in 6/8 it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in which 1 and 4 have more stress placed on them. And knowing the stress of the beat is also very important, because you have to know when it will be the most impactful to play something like a note from a melody or a chord or whatever. It's important to know when exactly you should play that to deliver the impact you want. If you want to see an example of this being done incorrectly, then you can listen to I believe the Demi Lovato version, the arrangement done for the Star Spangled Banner. I know it was covered by Adam Neely, but it is a good example of how the misplacement of things like chords just weakens the entire piece as a result. So, go give that a watch if you're interested in learning more about that. Now, I won't go into things like additive meters or rational time signatures. That's something you should really look into on your own if you're interested in, because it is very interesting. You can add some more interesting rhythmic quality to your music. But just overall, those are the main time signatures that you should keep in mind for performance and composition. And the best thing you can do with them is to experiment with them, see what you think of them, and go on from there. So with that being said, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful morning, noon, night, wherever you are in the world, and thank you for listening in.